1.4 million American children under the age of 6. You know how many have to be cared for by an adult all day, every day? All of them. That's why childcare is so essential. America literally doesn't work without it. It's high-skilled, high-intensity work that simply can't be outsourced or automated. The problem is, right now in America, the childcare marketplace is broken, and the result is an everyday crisis for working families and a slow-motion catastrophe for the American economy. Here's the deal. In a functioning marketplace, there would be a balance between the supply, in this case, childcare providers and what they charge, and the demand, families and what they can afford. But the true cost of high-quality care is so much higher than what the market can bear that it makes the whole system unstable. Providers have to pay for fixed costs like rent, food, books and toys, and supplies. But mostly they have to pay for people. That means the only way to keep costs down is to squeeze salaries. On average, childcare workers make just $11.65 an hour, and 53% rely on some form of public assistance just to get by. Meanwhile, overburdened working families still have to stretch to pay. Infant care alone can cost as much as $24,000 a year, more than the federal poverty level for a family of 3. And all that was before COVID-19. The pandemic has devastated the industry. Costs have soared, revenues have plunged, and thousands of providers have been forced to close their doors permanently. Without action, the childcare marketplace may break down entirely. So, how do we save it? Well, fortunately, we have a blueprint, and the architects might surprise you. The United States military. Every year, the Department of Defense supplies or subsidizes high-quality care for more than 200,000 children. By treating childcare as mission essential, they ease the burden on families and providers, which makes both sides more resilient. The military views childcare not as a private need, but as a public investment. That's a model that can work for all Americans, preserving parental choice while paying the workforce what it deserves. It's the smart thing to do and the right thing to do. So if you want to throw a lifeline to working families and small businesses and jumpstart the economy, then support childcare as the public good that it is. Because the best place to start is always at the beginning.
Well, welcome everyone, and I hope you got something out of the video that we just put up. The video was produced in an effort at BPC to inform the non-early childhood audience of why the business model for childcare has been so problematic, especially during the COVID experience. Welcome everyone to this conversation. My name is Linda Smith, and I am the director of the Early Childhood Initiative at BPC. And for those of you who don't know us, BPC is a Washington, D.C. based think tank where we strive to find the best solutions from both sides of the aisle to put forward policy solutions that will meet the challenges faced by our nation. And there's nothing more challenging right now than the childcare and its link to our economy and getting our families back to work. So what we're going to do today is take a look at some of the things that you saw in the video. What was going on before and after COVID, or during COVID, I should say, not after. We should only be so lucky. Impacts on families, children, and the staff who are in the childcare programs around the country. What are some strategies for relief? And then what are the long-term solutions that we should all be looking towards as we begin to come out of this pandemic time? So I want to note that this is the first in a series of sessions that we're going to have a conversation with people who are out there providing childcare around the country. The next one will be March 5th, when we will bring in family childcare providers from around the country to talk about the impact it's having on the home-based providers in our country. So with that, let me get started. I want to introduce my co-host and I guess partner in crime here from Brownstein I'm going to stumble on this one, Rada. It's a long term here. Rada Moen, who is the Senior Policy Advisor and Counsel at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. She also serves as the Executive Director of the Early Care and Education Consortium, or ECEC. And just to note, these people that you're going to be hearing from today, across this country in 2020, they provided care for over 750,000 children. So it's very important that we hear what they have to say about their experiences pre, during, and hopefully post-COVID. So Rada, I'm going to turn it over to you and you can introduce our participants today and then we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Linda, and to the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this roundtable. As Linda noted, the Early Care and Education Consortium is the trade association for the nation's leading multi-state, multi-site, high-quality licensed early learning and child care programs, as well as select state associations. We represent over 7,000 children and care for over 750,000 children in 48 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, as well as select international locations. Our members serve as the collective unified voice for providers of high quality programs and services that support families and children from diverse cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. We advocate for strong federal and state policies that promote affordability and access for all children and focus on bringing quality to scale. Joining us here today are a few members of ECEC. And I'll introduce our panelists briefly. Their full bios are posted for those that are interested. We've got Reggie Bika, President of Shine Early Learning, Joanna Klein, Vice President of Marketing and Customer Experience of the Learning Care Group, Maggie Moore, the Director of Government Relations of the Learning Experience, Rachel Robertson, the Vice President of Education and Development at Bright Horizons, David Smith, President of the Ohio Association of Child Care Providers and Executive Director of Horizon Education Center, Cynthia Turner, Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Officer of Goddard School Systems, and Tom Wyatt, Chief Executive Officer and a member of the Board of Directors at KinderCare Education, the largest child care provider in the country.
Okay, well, thank you. And I really do want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for hopefully a candid conversation about what you all have been facing during COVID. I want to remind the audience that you can submit questions to the panel. We will take time at the end of this discussion for audience questions, so you can submit those in the chat function, and we'll be looking forward to hearing from those of you around the country. So let's get started with our first question, and I just going around, ask you guys to sort of describe your business, your business model, I should say, and how has it been impacted by the COVID experience, and what are the challenges that you have faced over the last year when it comes to operating and just staying in business? I'm going to start, Joanna, with you. If you would start us off with this.
Yes, very happy to. Thank you. So as you saw in the video that you watched, I think one of the first things that it's important to understand is obviously our teachers are the lifeblood of our schools, and by far and for good reason, their salaries are our biggest expense. And so as I talk through the impact of COVID, a key component of this is how the staffing model changed through this experience. So when COVID hit, within a single week in March, childcare providers saw center enrollment drop by more than 80%. It literally fell off a cliff. So we wrestled with which schools to keep open and how to ensure that we were able to safely provide childcare to the children of essential workers, our doctors, our nurses, our linemen, our grocery workers, who desperately needed us so that they could go to work and serve their communities. So as we're making those very tough decisions, we're also making dramatic changes to operations in our schools. Parents are no longer able to enter the building, so we have to add staff to bring children from the front door to their classroom at drop off and pick up. We put temperature checks in place. Our staff starts wearing masks. We have enhanced cleaning procedures that we've implemented across all of our centers. Something simple like serving meals, it gets turned upside down. Family style dining is actually a very important component of quality early childhood education, but immediately we had to stop everything and put new meal processes in place. And we worked to ensure that children were able to stay in stable groups so that there was less commingling and less potential for the virus to spread. But that was also a change to a business model where toward the end of a day or in the beginning of a day, when you might have 3 4-year-olds and 3 3-year-olds, you blend those groups. That's not happening anymore. And then beyond that, across many states, we saw our ratios change. So we were no longer able to have as many children with a single teacher as we had before. We absolutely understood the need for that as we grappled with COVID-19. But that again, in addition to the operational expenses around health and safety, adding labor to bring children to classrooms and back to their parents, added significant expense to center costs. So as we fast forward to today, for the centers that are open, and I've seen statistics that show that as many or more as a quarter of centers in the country are still closed, we are still not near our pre-COVID enrollment levels and are still operating under most of the same changes that I mentioned and with these same increases in costs.
Okay, let's talk. Dave, you represent an association, in the Association of Child Care Providers in Ohio. Sort of what are your thoughts on this? What happened in your centers in Ohio?
Basically, what happened in Ohio is pretty much what happened in the rest of the country, I believe. Basically, we were totally closed down for a couple months, and then we were allowed to open with much limited capacity, and of course increased sanitation requirements. Like not having people come in the center, and like Joanne had mentioned. The real challenge was that these things all cost a lot more money to have the extra staff, but the real challenge is that our ratios were very low, which meant that we weren't getting the revenue in. Basically, based on a survey we did back last year, after the reopening, most of the centers in Ohio were operating at 42% of pre-COVID revenues, but 67 to 70% of expenses. As you can see, that's not a good business model to run a program or run any kind of business. So that was definitely a major challenge for us. I know that many centers have not reopened because of this, because of the challenges and the expense. So basically, as a rule of thumb, I mean, childcare is a very low margin business, and really requires somewhere around 90% of your actual capacity. I'm talking pre-COVID capacity to actually break even, and to be in the black. So major challenges with the way our systems are built around the business of childcare.
I think it's important to note, I say this because I think sometimes in this country, people don't recognize that these are businesses. Even family childcare are small businesses. And I think there's often the connection to the education world where there's this funding coming in, and in childcare, it's not our model. And I think sometimes it gets lost on our audiences. Maggie, what's your thinking on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. The learning experience, we have 270 centers nationwide in 25 states, and 90% are owned by franchisees. So they are small business owners. And being a small business owner of a child care center, it's not plug and play. It's a highly regulated space. We're caring and educating for little ones from 0 to 6 years old. And also we have to, as a small business owner, we have to employ a really high skilled and trained and qualified workforce. So as a small business owner throughout the pandemic, and having seen it with our franchisees in 25 different states and how they had to pivot and go about adjusting to the health and safety requirements, as well as, finding that staff that is already difficult to find pre-pandemic, and having to add staff because of the new ratio changes, the burden was really felt as a small business owner.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, can you jump in on this one, because your business model is a little bit different than some of the other ones with the Bright Horizons, and I can only imagine what happened when businesses shut their doors.
Yes, so I represent Bright Horizons, and our business model is to support on-site or near-site childcare, working with the business community, the employers, and sometimes it's a dedicated on-site childcare center, and sometimes it's a consortium or a near-site. And one of the things that happened pre-pandemic, but we saw a big demand for during the pandemic and still are, is backup care, where if your regular child care falls through, then you have a backup plan that you can use that. And a lot of employers invest in that. And as you can imagine, that has been incredibly high demand, but lower ability to provide those services, because children, the exposure risk and children coming in and out of buildings, and families, of course, we heard Joanna mention families can't come in the buildings. And then when the employer has closed their campus, then the access to childcare is also closed for those families. So their decision about childcare is dependent on the employers. Many employers have stepped up and really provided good services and support to ensure that we can retain teachers and leaders, but it is a big challenge for the business community as well. And I'll just add, if I can, this one thing I wanted to mention just on behalf of all of early childhood is, we're so much more, this group represents so much more than custodial care or what you'd call maybe daycare. This is high quality early care and education, and that's so much harder to implement and provide. And there's a lot more cost and sophistication, and we don't want to lose the teachers and leaders that are dedicated to that. And that's been really at risk as most of their days are spent focusing on health and safety procedures, not having parents in the building, communication with families, exposures, et cetera. So it's important to distinguish that it's even a higher level, and we're putting that high quality at risk, which is so important.
Mm-hmm. Tom, what's been the experience with you're a very large provider in pretty much most every state. What's been your experiences?
Linda, we to put in perspective and go back to a comment that Joanna made, we were on March the 13th of 2020, we were at the height of the most children that we were ever impacting inside of our centers. We had a little over 140,000 children that were in our centers every day. On that was March 13th. March 20th, we had 12,000. So it was devastating to us. We immediately closed down 1,100 of our 1,500 centers. We left 400 of them open for essential workers, and which meant a lot to us. We're a mission-based industry. We're certainly a mission-based company, and that felt good to us. But I will tell you, all 400 of those centers were losing money during all of April, May, June, and July that they stayed open to literally support the workers that Joanna spoke to. The other thing that I would add that has been said well, both by David, Joanna, and Rachel as well, is that the incurring cost that we had during this time was significant. And with much less children in the center, much less revenue, candidly, we at KinderCare even added an additional center director in all of those 400 centers, literally as a health ambassador, health and safety ambassador, to literally support the center director with all that was going on, the complexity that was going on in the center and all the new protocols that we put in place and what have you. So we literally doubled up on the center management. We also had very inefficient rooms, and many of the states, as you well know, were actually compromising the number of children we could have in a room regardless of ratios. So it was significant for us. It was a very, very difficult time. We began to open our centers literally by state in June, opened all of our centers by, we have 100% of our centers open at this point by the end of July and August, or first part of August. And 70% of those centers are still losing money because of the extra expense we have in PP&E, the extra expense we have in labor, and the lack, quite frankly, of children.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting thing, in terms of the health and safety, and that, people put in the centers. I've said for a very long time that if childcare doesn't know one thing, it knows sanitation and health. I mean, that's been drilled into childcare now for decades, and so, but I think given all that's happened, I think we also have an obligation to help the public understand what precautions are being taken around health and safety. Because sometimes our survey work shows that parents are nervous about health and safety issues. And I think this is just an area where we could do a better job of communicating to parents exactly what we do. For example, what you said, and is that a thought going forward? So does anybody else want to jump in on this one before we move to the next question?
Well, I just want to share one thought. My name is Cynthia Turner. I'm with the Goddard School. We have schools in 38 states across the country. In addition to all of the good points that my colleagues made, the other struggle for the industry is just the length of this pandemic. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you how many of our center operators have said to me, if I just knew when we were going to get back to normal, I could plan for it, but I don't know that. Mm-hmm. And so that uncertainty creates a lot of anxiety and honestly, I think question about whether they want to continue in this field, because it has been, and I think we're going to talk about a little later, so stressful. So I think the length of the pandemic, the slow crawl to normal, mm-hmm. has exacerbated all of the things that my colleagues have already identified.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow on to something that a couple of you have alluded to here. And we talked about the enrollment, and we've talked a little bit about parents in the video. Parents' ability to pay doesn't match the cost to begin with. I mean, we struggle with that on a daily basis in childcare across this country. I was curious from you guys, how many of you take CCDF children, in other words, state subsidized children, in your programs? And I know early on with the CARES dollars, there was some effort to continue to pay for those children without, based on enrollment, not on attendance. Was that an effective strategy for you all? How much of the costs of the programs were you able to, get from that kind of funding? Anybody want to take that one?
I am happy to take that, Linda. About a third of our KinderCare's children are part of the block grant, if you will, subsidy support. And we're proud to say that we offer all communities access to KinderCare utilizing CCDBG. There were some states, Illinois, Arizona, there was a few states that offered that kind of support, California, which we obviously appreciated, but it wasn't consistent, as you know, around the country. So it helped in pockets, but going back to just the vast overrun of labor, overrun of new protocols of PPE support and what have you, and lower numbers of children in the centers, it helped. Please, I don't want to sound like I'm not grateful. I was very grateful, but it didn't. We were still unprofitable, vastly unprofitable in 2020.
Mm-hmm. If I can add Linda to that as well. Oh,
go ahead.
Learning Care Group also has about a third of our children whose tuition is paid for by these subsidies, and similarly, it was very helpful. But when you think about it, you could have two of our centers that were 10 miles apart, and one of them is receiving all of the support because it's a school that has a lot of children who receive subsidies. And 10 miles away, there's a center that's going through the exact same circumstances, but because of the population of their families, they're not receiving any of that support. So just seeing that imbalance was eye-opening for us, and certainly a challenge moving through the pandemic.
Somebody else wanted to jump in on this one. Was Reggie, did you?
It was me, Linda. Good to see you. Our business model at Oscillera Learning and Shine Early Learning is a little bit different than our colleagues because we're built primarily on Head Start and early Head Start, but then use the child care block grant subsidy funding to wrap around services to extend care before school and after school for many of the families that we serve. What we found was, building on what Tom said, it was really vital to our ability to sustain and maintain our employees. We were very fortunate to come through this thus far without having to lay off any of our or furlough and our employees, but it was very difficult. Each state had different approaches at different times. It seemed idiosyncratic. There were different messages that came through at different times. And that really has been and continues to be a challenge for us at Ocelero.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's keep moving here because I got several questions that we really want to get to. We've talked a little bit about the business model that you all have, and I think one of the things we'd like to sort of pivot to is, well, we're all in the business of serving children and families, and we do that with, as has been noted, with a significant workforce. And I'm curious as to what you all are seeing in terms of what's happened with COVID and the impact on families, children, and your staff in these programs. Any challenges that you're seeing, what's going on there? So let's start, Reggie, let's go back to you and start with you.
Sure. Well, if I could, I want to start briefly with the families that we serve. As I mentioned, we serve predominantly Head Start and early Head Start families. And by definition, those families live below the federal poverty line. So in the best case scenarios, they're already struggling to get by. They don't have a lot of margin if they lose their positions and so forth. They're often caring for family members who, as we know statistically, have been hit hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic, and all the while, they're still wanting their kids to be ready for kindergarten when they leave our program. Add into that then our staff who have comparable challenges. You showed in the video the average wage for staff in the childcare industry. Ocelero and our partners through Shine are roughly in that same pay scale. Our staff are worried, despite our assurances to the contrary, whether or not they're going to have an income. Are they going to stay employed or not employed? I didn't hear from our colleagues, but one of the things we've really struggled with this year is EFMLA. And staff who, because their children are home from school, are eligible now for a leave of absence. And so they would say, I'm sorry, I have to care for my own kids. I'm not eligible to come in to work. That was a great benefit for many families, but put an extra burden on our ability to staff up appropriately in our programs that were open. And then just the anxieties of the uncertainty of this industry. Do I go to work if I can go to work? Is it safe for me at work, even with PPE and all of the cleaning that we have going on? Is it safe for my family? What if I bring the virus home to my family? Questions now about the vaccine. Is it safe to get vaccinated? Should I get vaccinated? I want to get vaccinated. Can I get vaccinated? These are just a few of the many challenges that our staff are experiencing as they're trying to come to work every day and not only provide care for children, but provide them a high quality early learning environment.
Reggie, can I follow up on that? Because one of the things that we learned in our most recent survey of parents was they are very concerned about the vaccine. Mm-hmm. And I'd be curious, going around this, quickly, how many states have prioritized childcare workers for the vaccine?
We are served in 4 states through Ocelero. We're represented in 26 states through our partners. In those 4 states, only 2 of them, I believe, thus far have allowed childcare to be a preferred group of people. It's interesting that in some states, K-12 teachers are ahead of childcare workers, despite the fact that the childcare industry serves a similar population, but even more so than the K-12 sector does, because we're serving people's children while they're at work themselves. Whereas K-12, I think, has more opportunities to close the doors, to serve children virtually, and other strategies that we simply don't have in the childcare industry.
Interesting. Others on this one, Tom, for example, you're in many, many states. How many states, generally speaking, are prioritizing childcare workers?
I was sitting here thinking about the exact number. It's about 75% of the states that we're in. We're in 40 states in the District of Columbia. So we've been pretty pleased with that. And I'll tell you something that that is happening now. As you know, we also have a before and after school program, and many of those school systems are actually taking our teachers with their teachers to be vaccinated. So we were really pleased with the support of the community, of the school systems, to help us get our students, or excuse me, get our teachers vaccinated.
Okay. Joanna, what about you guys? What are you seeing?
We're seeing the same things as KinderCare is seeing at Learning Care Group. We operate in 38 states. We're seeing the majority of the states look to prioritize childcare workers. The challenge, of course, is availability of the vaccine. You know, like many other providers, Learning Care Group is doing what we can to ensure that we make it easy for employees to get vaccinated, paying them for their time when they go, understanding that we might need to shift schedules. But first and foremost, there has to be a vaccine available for them in their community. And that's the biggest challenge today.
Okay. Well, let's keep going back on what's going on with your staff and children and parents. You know, Dave, why don't you represent, you know, a vast array of programs in Ohio. What are you seeing on this particular issue? What's going on with families, children, et cetera?
Well, one of the big challenges that we've seen in Ohio, and I'm sure it's the same way across the country, you know, is when we came back, we were closed down for a couple months by the governor, and then we were allowed to reopen with limited people. But one of the challenges we had was a lot of our teachers, particularly our more veteran teachers, were older or had some kind of health condition. And so basically that did not help off the starting block. So losing those people, which are not even replaceable right now because of the pandemic and the number of people that are available even for the workforce. So that's a major challenge. The other thing too is all the stresses that are involved now in operating a center. Basically, as some of my colleagues mentioned before, limited ratio numbers and keeping groups isolated so they can't basically spread it inside of a center. Also cause problems with teachers being isolated. Usually where teachers were teaching in teams, with multi groups. Now they're spending the whole day with just the same kids in the same classroom, and very limited interaction with other groups in the center. That causes a lot of stress, and for some people, too much stress, and they've left the industry. So right now we're having a really hard time getting new people and training them. Also, we can't do in-person training, and we can't do a lot of the on-the-job type training where you have a new teacher shadow an old teacher and that type of thing because of the requirements to keep everybody isolated. The other really big stressor is the quarantines. Because the virus is spreading, mainly amongst adults. I mean, in Ohio, it's very, 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 very few kids are actually getting COVID. It's mainly the teachers and the staff who are getting it outside of the centers, who are then becoming positive, and then quarantines have to be put in place. Health departments have to be contacted, and what's happening is that's causing a lot of stress. Particularly, we did have the benefit of having those 10 days of sick leave that companies' organization could use to pay their staff while they're quarantining. Of course, those days are gone, and they did extend it into the first quarter. But most of those days were used up in the height of the pandemic. So that's also another retention issue as far as trying to find money to pay staff when they are quarantining. The other thing with the quarantines that's bad is that if centers are closed, which quite a few centers in Ohio were closed by the health departments, is that it's unreliable then for parents who are working, and then they need to find alternative care. We've noticed many centers that have had it quarantined for 2 weeks, which is pretty standard. You lose a percentage of your enrollment already from a depleted enrollment. So that's the many challenges.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Others on this issue?
I'd like to speak to this, please, if possible, for quarantine. Some of the impacts of that, if there even was a child's parent was diagnosed, that was considered exposure. And we've kept health and safety our number one priority. And so we would, report to the health department and we'd have to close that classroom. In addition to what Dave mentioned, paying the staff, we also, for the children's in the classroom that had to be quarantined for that 10 to 14 days, depending on the state, we reimbursed their tuition for at that time. So to talk about, the increased costs of quarantine, of, still paying staff during that time, as well as lost revenue of returning that tuition as well.
Cynthia, what about you? What have you been seeing?
All of the same things. Center operators not knowing what to expect on any particular day. When the phone rings, is it going to be another COVID case? Are they going to have to find staff? We see enrollment is, new families come to sign up and then existing families leave. There's a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability about the current situation. And it's very stressful. I think it's stressful for everybody. And then that can impact the children's experience and their development.
Mm-hmm. We have been hearing that children's challenging behaviors are certainly, children with challenging behaviors have increased. And you can understand that with the stress on parents and families and work and everything else. Do you have enough support on that? Okay, Rachel, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I can segue into that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
I just wanted to build off of what Tom and others said earlier too about being essential worker and classified as essential workers has felt really good. And while we have known that in the past about our employees, that hasn't been broadly accepted, and now it is. So there's some good progress there, and that recognition is great. We have a number of hospital and pharmaceutical centers attached to clients and energy, and that our whole system would have struggled if those families, those parents couldn't have had childcare. So that business community part is clear that childcare is necessary for the economy, but included with the teachers, the leadership, the administration, it's just the high stakes of what they are expected to do right now to keep children and families safe. Mm-hmm. In a way, a reduced ability to do that, not being able to go in classrooms, not being able to sub out staff very easily to give someone a break for children's behaviors, families being very stressed out, needing a lot of support. The ambiguity about jobs, where everybody's feeling that in our industry, but also all our parents are feeling that. And we know women are disproportionately affected. Parents in general are really affected, having to make choices about leaving the workforce. So we're seeing that all of that would be stressful in the best of times, and all together, plus the pandemic, it's untenable levels of stress for everyone.
Let's keep going here because we got a couple other questions we want to get to, and we do want to get to a couple of audience things. I think we've been a little bit clear. Can you just say quickly how the CARES Act dollars helped you all? What did we learn from that experience? Because as we keep moving forward in this country, what else needs to be done is a big question, especially here in Washington. So just if we could do a quick, what was your experiences with the CARES funding that went out, the original, and now more is going out as of right now. So let's just start, Joanna, with you on that one.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, we are so grateful and thankful for the way the government stepped up to support the childcare industry, understanding that our economic recovery and frankly, maintenance through the pandemic was dependent on having an available and stable childcare sector. So that support to see it and the dialogue, as Rachel mentioned, has been tremendous overall. For Learning Care Group, the funding that we saw and expect to continue to see through the new Appropriations Act is vital for us to be able to keep our doors open. Tom mentioned how many schools are still operating at a loss. That's the exact same situation for us. Enrollment levels have not returned to where they had been. It will take some time for that to happen, but we have to make sure that the industry is secure so that as these families do return to work, they have somewhere safe and a quality early childhood education provider to send their child every day. I will say that delivery of the grants was inconsistent in many cases from state to state. That's certainly challenging to manage. And there were some states that seemed to really understand what the providers needed out of the gate in a more direct way than some others. So we're continuing to do advocacy where we can to help our state partners understand all of the ways in which providers need to be supported, regardless of whether or not they take subsidy, and the different areas of our operational model that were impacted.
Okay. Tom, what about you?
Just sort of complimenting what Joanna said. We went through many of the things that obviously she mentioned, but one thing that hasn't been discussed in two different forms of expenses, the health and safety protocols that we put into place. Obviously, this industry has always been, health and safety has been a focal point for us. But now more than ever, the rigor behind health and safety protocols has been significant. We literally put all of our folks through multiple, if you will, educational processes to change, quite frankly, the business model inside the center. Joanna spoke about having to take a child from the front door all the way back to the classroom. Parents don't go back into the classrooms anymore. The health and safety, if you're the wellness center in the front where we actually do the thermometer, the temperature checks and what have you, all of that had to be retrained, and it was a new muscle for them. So that was an issue. The other one, which you mentioned a little bit about it a minute ago, about the impact of COVID to children, but as we were opening our centers in June, July, and August, we found children were mentally in a very different place. Children that we knew very, very well who came back with behaviors that we never had seen before. Very frustrated, in cases, candidly violent, fighting with other children when they were friends, 4 or 5 months ago. And so we literally spent money through our curriculum to literally spend a 10-day course up front, bringing children back to their point before, just about socializing, about respecting each other's privacy, about respecting each other's space. It was literally a piece of curricula that and Alana, Linda, but Dr. Yalo put in place in our centers. And every center, when they opened, they literally spent the first 10 days doing nothing but that to get the children to a point that they could socialize in a proper setting and do what have you. So again, just a number of different expense variations to our normal model that were significant. That was millions of dollars for KinderCare.
Thank you. And that's, somebody else want to jump in on this?
I was going to jump in, Linda. Thank you. The $3.5 billion that Congress appropriated through the CARES Act funding was incredibly important to our company. As I mentioned earlier, we were able to maintain all of our positions. We didn't have to lay anybody off. That was critical for us. But I also want to mention the appropriations that went to Head Start and Early Head Start, and the stability of that funding has meant has had a very positive impact on Head Start and Early Head Start, those programs that serve the most vulnerable of families across the country. And I think there are lessons learned from how Congress appropriates funding for Head Start and Early Head Start, and how we can ripple those ideas into the broader childcare market in ways that could be more sustainable and get more kids into high quality childcare across the country.
That's, Reggie, it's interesting you say that, because we spent a fair amount of time looking at the use of grants and contracts to stabilize the supply in this country, as opposed to just a purely, vouchered system. We need a better balance. I think that was one of the points of the video that we're trying to get to people. We need to stabilize the supply. And I think the Head Start grants being stable throughout this helped an enormous amount within that community. So I think it's something for all of us to note. I'm going to scoot on here because I'm looking at the clock, and I do take a couple questions from the audience if we can. The last thing I wanted you guys to do, if you can, is I'm going to give you your one opportunity to say something to either your state government or Congress that you think they need to consider as we move forward to try to address the issues of childcare, not just in the short term, but in the long term. I think we've all figured out that we have a business model that's in danger. So what is it that Congress or the state government can do to make this a more stable business model? So who wants to take that one first? I'm looking
Linda, I'm happy to jump in.
Okay, go for it, Tom.
As you know, I've before coming to Shine, I served 2 governors, one in Wisconsin and one in Colorado, and advised them on these issues. And the first thing that I told both of them is that we need to stop thinking of childcare as either a work support or an early learning strategy, but rather recognize in the 21st century that it is both, and to align our policies and funding priorities to benefit both sides of parents having a reliable place for their kids to go while they're at work, and children being better prepared for kindergarten. And some of these things that I would suggest are subsidy rates being reimbursed at a much higher rate for higher quality care. As you mentioned, it costs more to provide good quality care. Let's have our subsidy rates prioritize that in even more dramatic fashion. Pay for enrollment instead of paying for attendance, or at least having some broader attendance ratios. The costs are still there. We're still paying a teacher and having food and curriculum and so forth. If a child doesn't come because they're feeling ill that day, the high quality provider shouldn't be dinged accordingly. And I would lastly say, use this crisis to challenge some old assumptions about our system. Don't just think about how do we use these new dollars to get us carried through the pandemic, but rather how do we leverage these new dollars in ways that will strengthen our system so that when we come out of the pandemic, our child care system across the country is more sustainable, is serving more children and their parents at much higher quality levels of care than we are today. I've got a whole list of ideas to share with folks. If they want to talk, I won't spend more time on it today.
Well, I do want to keep going, but it's one of the things that we've spent some time looking at is we need to go from a market rate to a cost of quality strategy in this country, because I think the market rate, we've said this and we don't have time to get into that right now, but as policy calls go, I mean, we need to rethink that whole piece. Who else wants to? That was 4, Reggie. I counted them, just so you got 4 in there. But
Linda, there's probably 15 on my list, though, Linda.
Oh, wait, you can share. You can share.
Linda, I'll make mine short and quick. Short term, we need recovery funds. We need to get this industry back on its feet. We need to cover costs that candidly have been deferred from 2020, have not yet even been paid, and also to help us get the occupancy up to where we can make a profit in the centers that are already open and operating. Then long term, it's accessibility to me. And Reggie spoke about accessibility relative to CCDBG and raising the rates from a standpoint of that point of view. That certainly helps the low income side. I'd also say, and I'll go back to the tax credit that we talked about earlier, to help middle class families that are taking on a significant expense, putting their children into high quality childcare and early learning experiences. And I'd say those 2 things, if we focused on those 2 alone, the recovery of the industry, because it's limping. Somebody said earlier, and I believe they're right, 25 to 28% of the centers are not open yet and may never open. And we were already in a childcare desert before we started. So that's important. And then the second part is let's help families, young families who are scrambling to make a living and for both parents to work in a professional environment. Let's give them the opportunity to support their children through a high quality program.
Okay, Joanna, do you have a quick one there?
Yeah, I think I would echo everything that Tom said. As we move past the recovery, accessibility across all income brackets is just vital to ensuring that families are able to have their children in quality care while they support the economy.
Maggie, anything to add?
I'd also like to see.
Sorry, Rachel. Just when it comes to short-term and long-term, the pandemic's obviously brought to light childcare and its importance, and also the different provider types. And to provide support to stabilize industry for all providers of a mixed delivery system is crucial. As Joanna mentioned, the CARES $3.5 billion and how it was allocated throughout the states. A lot of folks were missed because some of the states didn't choose to use the flexibilities to award funds outside of contracted programs. So going forward, I'd say to support all providers, regardless of contracted or not, because they're here and they've been open for the past 10 months. And it's really the lifeline we need at this point.
Rachel, did you want to add to that?
I do. Thank you. So I think it's just important to say is we don't want to go back to business as usual, because business as usual was broken. And we want this to be a catalyst for change in the field, recognizing how important our work is in the early years. So echoing what other people have said is that the subsidy system, when everything flows through the subsidy system, it leaves out a lot of families and providers with a lot of space, high quality space for children. The tax credits for families are essential for middle-class working families. And I would also add is tax credits or incentives for employers to get involved. It's a benefit for employers, and they can be a big part of the solution of rebuilding the childcare industry.
Cynthia, did you want to add anything, or Dave, or the other?
I did. I wanted to add that I'd like, the Goddard system would like to see, a career path in early childhood education through a workforce development program. These are dedicated folks. This is a great career path for people who share this mission. And it's well worthy of a developed workforce program.
Dave, anything else?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to hand it back over to Radha. She's been waiting there, monitoring the questions coming in, and I think we have time for maybe one or two quick questions, Radha. So what are you seeing?
Sure, Linda. A lot of the questions have some overlap, so I might do a little bit of rephrasing over here to accommodate. But first one that we have is from Vanessa, and the question over here is, what specific legislative changes would support sustainability and resiliency for childcare providers? And if we could talk about that in terms of short-term versus long-term, that would also be great. So what's needed to immediately help the industry because of COVID-19, and then long-term solutions to support the overall resiliency of the industry.
Anybody want to take that?
I'd be glad to. I don't know if she's speaking to federal or state policies. Federal policies to make it more accessible and friendly to all providers. Removing the contracted specification would be helpful. And state policies, how they use the funds they receive from the federal government. Legislation, if there is barriers of how they can award CCDBG dollars, state legislation would be required to change that so they can allow for the flexibility to provide funds and relief to providers that are not contracted.
Anybody else? I think that's that's probably a whole conversation in and of itself, is where do we go in terms of some of those challenges. Anybody else want to take that, or do we go back to Rod?
I would say three things if I could, Linda.
Mm-hmm.
In the subsidy, increase rates for those who are serving low-income kids in high-quality settings. Secondly, expand eligibility to more low-income families or into low-middle-income families. And third, pass sustainable tax credits to help middle-income families make high-quality childcare affordable for them.
Okay. And Tom, did you want to say something?
You know what? I was sitting here listening to Reggie, and I'd just like to say, well said, Reggie. When he added the tax credits, I was comfortable.
I got you, KinderCare. It's all good.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Rada, back to you.
Actually, the next question that we have relates directly to the tax credits and better understanding how this supports families. So there's been a lot of talk about the variety of tax credits. Can our panelists talk a little bit about how this will actually help the families that you serve, and what a long-term expansion could mean?
Anybody on that one?
I can jump in and just say that the burden of childcare expenses is high on middle-class families or those that don't qualify for any subsidized care. So this would alleviate some of that cost. It's a great step in the right direction. Of course, we would advocate that it's expanded and extended. So those families have that relief and the infrastructure they need so they can work, especially, again, I mentioned this before, but we know women are dropping out of the workforce significantly right now. And many of our clients are expressing a lot of concern about losing the progress we've made with women in the workforce, especially in tech or engineering types of fields. So that tax credit will allow for us to not slide backward and to allow middle income families to afford childcare.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on this? Do parents, in your view, I mean, parents, I think they're often, the child and dependent care tax credit is one that kind of slides off this radar screen frequently. In your estimation, are your parents using it? Do they care about it? Do you hear about it from them?
We actually try to tell our parents about it. We want to make sure that they're aware that this is going to be available to them. You know, when we talk about CCDBG, Reggie had mentioned expanding eligibility into, low middle income families. I don't know if everyone realizes what those income eligibility thresholds look like and how many middle class families are truly struggling to afford childcare. It can be the second highest, or in some cases, depending on where they live, their highest monthly expense. And so any way that we can support these families so they can offset that cost is incredibly valuable.
Well, and to put it into context too, one of the parents often is working to pay for childcare, and they want to stay in the workforce to grow their career for benefits reasons, but their salary is going to childcare when it's not subsidized. So that's how big of an expense it can be for these families.
Mm-hmm. Radha, any other quick questions? Because I think we have about 2 minutes here.
Yep. Linda, we've got one question from Sharia. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing her name. The question over here is essentially, are you going to have future panels with caregivers and teachers as well? And can you talk about future BPC, the future BPC events as well?
I can, and that's probably a good way to wrap this up. As I said when we opened, our next one is going to be with family childcare providers. We're right now planning on 4 of these family childcare providers. Then the small independent, what we fondly call mom and pops in this country, and then finally parents. That's an excellent suggestion, and would be happy to pursue that, to bring some actual childcare workforce in and have them talk about their experiences. So whoever said that, follow up with us. I appreciate the suggestion, and we'll take a look at that. I think that would add to this conversation enormously. So anything else on there, Radha, that we need to fix? Or I think we're actually ready to wrap it up here and end this. Thank you guys. This very valuable and rich conversation. I can't thank you all enough. It's very, very important that your voices get heard, both here in Washington and around the country in the state houses, etc. It's our opportunity, I think, to use lessons that we've learned from the experiences of the last year to try and figure out where are we going in this country with something that actually can support a better business model at the end of the day, support our parents, more broadly, and certainly provide the best that we can for our children. So with that, I want to thank all of you and the Early Care and Education Consortium, Radha, in your group, for helping us with this. And we look forward to a continued conversation with you guys. And Reggie, next time you can have 5. Or maybe a dozen, okay? So with that, okay, guys, thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.